Yeah. Thanks all for coming. It's freezing here, so I hope I can at least warm your heart with the presentation. So pollination in protected cropping, that's what I'm going to talk about, but specifically largely about apple, which is what we're working on at the moment. So it's not a finished talk like, look what we've done. It's more a talk like, look what we're doing. Okay. Oh. Is that good? Is that okay. It doesn't move. Okay. Yeah. That one. No. There we go. Patience. Okay. So not my forte. When it comes to food crops, 75% of crop species depend to some extent on pollination, on a visiting animal. Our staple foods do not. So rice, potato, lentils, chickpeas, wheat don't. And that then means that those 75% of crop species are 30% of what we eat. But it contains 75% of our vitamin C, large proportion of vitamin A, E, calcium, fluoride, and iron, and 95% of folic acid. It doesn't only involve fruit and nuts. It also involves hybrid vegetable seed production that relies on pollinators, seeds of food plants for livestock, and altogether, pollinators are responsible for 9% of the world's crop production in GDP. So it's not to be sniffed at. For Australia, it has been estimated to have a value, the crops have been estimated to have a value of $14.2 billion. So that is quite big. In South Australia, our main crops are almond, lucerne seed, canola, and apple when it comes to reliance on pollination, and that presents a value of around $350 million, last I looked. So who's providing that pollination? Well, there's been a publication about the visitors of 37 crop studies, and what they found was that it varies, but most people think of honeybees as the only pollinator, and honeybees in this case are the dark blue color, native bees are the bright blue color, and what you see is that honeybees are important, but other pollinators are at least as important or more important, and in some cases those other pollinators are beetles, like in custard apple, or flies, largely. So how important and which pollinators varies. In some cases, there are even human pollinators. Hand pollination and pollination by drones happens more and more. But in general, what we can say is we rely on a large number of pollinators. And here you have some Australian native species of pollinators. I depicted them on Australian native plants, apart from the blue-banded bee that is interested in a tomato flower. But most of these can be found on crops. Not all of them go to crops, but several do. What this slide emphasizes is that they rely on the presence of other food in the landscape. Why? Well, crops often flower short, and these bees are out there when the crop is not in flower. They don't have a beekeeper to look after them and transport them to somewhere else. So they need that support in the landscape to be there. And that is an issue that is coming more and more to the fore. It was emphasized by the fact, well, let's change this to saying that we are increasingly relying on a single pollinator, Apis mellifera, and that's dangerous. Why? Because a single species can get a disease and then plummet. And that has happened to some extent in the world, where a mite jumped from Apis cerana to Apis mellifera. That mite is a vector and incubator of viruses, and those viruses really affected Apis mellifera. That's still an issue. The mite and its associated viruses are all over the world except for Australia. And it's regularly intercepted. Annually, it is intercepted, the mite, but we haven't got it yet, but it will come. And what happens then is we will lose our feral honeybees that provide free pollination. That might be a blessing in disguise for nature, but not for crop pollination. What will also happen is that all hobby beekeepers will give up because it's too difficult to manage hives, and that the beekeepers, the professional beekeepers, will ask a hell of a lot more for their pollination services. And we can say how much that will be in the long run because we can compare ourselves to the US. And in the US, beekeepers get 60% of their income from pollination services, 40% from hive products. In Australia, beekeepers get 20% of their income from pollination services and 80% from hive products. So that landscape will change and the price for pollination will go up when we get this miting. Another example where we relied on one species that had disastrous effects is, of course, the Irish famine. We had a whole country reliant on one staple food. That staple food went to mush because of a nematode, and that caused 1 million people to die and 2.5 million to move elsewhere. Those are major impacts. So reliance on a single species is just plain stupid. The stimulation of diversity in pollinators is becoming more and more difficult because we will need to use more land to produce our food. And that land generally doesn't support pollinators because we're producing food. So part of the solution for this is, of course, protected cropping. Protected cropping is fantastic. Take, for instance, tomatoes. You can plant twice as many plants per hectare. They will yield 5 times more fruit than compared to the open. That means 10 times more fruit per hectare. And they use 5 times less water. You can recover the wastewater, you can recycle the nutrients, you can do pest control much better, and you are protected from the elements. Protected cropping is simply fantastic and the way to go. And then you get pollination. And pollination in protected cropping is an issue because now you have to put your pollinators in a greenhouse or under net. And there's a lot of greenhouse crops and crops under net that rely on pollination, where we have to supply those pollinators under the net to achieve crops or to produce crops. The issue is, of course, that protected cropping affects light, humidity, and temperature. The resources, the animals cannot get anything else, and often the crop alone is not enough to support them. It's not nutritious enough. There are chemical residues there, and we've just submitted a paper detailing all that, all those problems. Light is an issue because pollinators use it to orient, of course. Temperature can be rather up than down, and humidity is also up, and that can influence the functioning of the pollinators, their fungi that they have, or the production even of nectar by the crop plants. resources I've already covered, and chemical residues is an obvious one. So we look in this paper at mitigations, the mitigations that have been tried. And so with light, you can choose different cover materials. If you use polycarbonate, it's very dark. There are covers like glass that let more light through, and pollinators often depend on part of the UV spectrum and need that for orientation. So that those changing cover materials works, hive placement works, providing landmarks for orientation doesn't work very well. And similarly, ventilation hasn't been shown to work yet. Afternoon shade against heat works really well for pollinator health, and CO2 helps with nectar production. With resources, that is where mitigation really helps. Providing additional food sources works. Providing outside access is really good for pollinator health. Stopping rates, bring them down in protected cropping, because that ensures that there are just enough pollinators, but they're not competing amongst themselves. And rotation didn't work because this is done with hives that social bees that are used to a certain environment, and then you place them somewhere else and they die because they can't reorient. So chemical residues, of course, you need to look at the timing, the type, and the amount of application when you have pollinators in the system, and preferably we use biological control. And when it comes to chemicals, I'd like to give a plug to a paper that Jay and I just published. It's a review of the impact of non-insecticidal pesticides on bees and their interaction with insecticides. And that is really, really an important issue, because no one had reviewed the effects of fungicides on bees as yet. So that's out there now. Overview, that review of the mitigation strategies in protected cropping, is part of a project that is funded by the Australian government, the Department of Agriculture, under the Agriculture for Profit scheme, and it is led by Hort Innovation. It involves plant food research, the University of New England, the University of Tasmania, New South Wales DBI, and Seed Purity. And the crops that we look at are raspberry, blueberry, apple, cherry, carrot, and a number of others. We in South Australia are funded by G2 Netting Systems, who really wants the effects of netting on bees sorted out, the Weight Research and the Weight Research Institute. And it involves myself, Jay, Lizzie, Scott used to be involved in it, but has left us now, and Beth as well. So, apple. When you go into the Adelaide Hills, you see more and more areas covered in netting. Netting is going up fast, it is subsidized, and it protects fruit against hail, birds, sunburn, and it helps with evaporation. The outlay is enormous. It costs 60,000 per hectare to net an orchard, and apparently it earns itself back in 3 years. That is good, because you have to renew it every 5-6 years. So it's not cheap at all. Of course, the issue is the netting reduces bee activity. Visitation and set is down by 30 to 70%. And when you realize that an apple flower needs to be visited about 10 times to get sufficiently pollinated, this is a real issue, right? Okay, so we, Jay, Lizzie, and I are looking at, can we manage the nets to enhance hive health, which I'm not going to talk about, and pollination, which I am going to talk about. Can we improve pollen delivery on the net? And can we encourage the presence of native bees on the net? Those are the 3 points that I will talk about. Now, there's different types of nets. We've got rice net and we've got hail net. Rice net is low and floppy. Hail net is high and taut. Rice net is made so that when it hails, in between the trees, when once enough hail has been collected, it falls down in between the trees. Hail net, you get the hail, it's very strong. You get the hail on top and it will form big sacks until it's melted. So rice net is newer, and rice net is closed with bungees. Now those bungees can be crossed, can cross the fabric, or they can be straight. There is another layer of fabric in between, and then it falls through like that. The advantage of having rice net is that you can open the roof over certain rows. You can't do that with hail net. A disadvantage of rice net is that it is fairly low over the canopy. And when you think about a bee orienting, a bee, nearly all insects that orient in the landscape, they use landmarks in the distance. And when they cannot get above the trees, well, they can't see their hive for the trees, really. They cannot orient, so you probably lose more bees. Okay, so that's about netting. Then you get bees stuck in nets. And this is a real issue. It can be at the folds, and it can be because of the type of weave that you have. I have been looking at how many bees get stuck in what type of net. Very inspiring work, not? And but what we found was that when you have that cross bungee closed, a lot of bees get stuck in that net, and that's about nearly 1 per square meter. If you have 2 hectares of this, you have a whole hive stuck, right? So that's how much it is. So what can you do? You can open every 4th row, and that reduces that immensely, because bees know where to get out, where to get in, and they have other light, probably. We don't know that yet, but that white fabric reflects light in all ways, and bees use polarized light to find their way as well. So with straight bungees, you don't have the number of bees stuck. It's also a lighter fabric. It's a bit different, was a bit different. And then for the hail net, we found that when it's above a certain height, you get less bees stuck in there. Probably they don't fly much higher than 5-6 meters anyway, and so that is high enough for them to orient in that landscape. Now, boring as academically this work, although I don't mind walking through a flowering orchard and looking up a bit, but for the rest, boring as, but it's straight advice to growers, right? Are you buying a new rice net? Well, buy one with straight bungees if you want to do something for bees. Do you already have a rice net and cross bungees? Well, maybe open every 4th row. Are you buying a hail net? Make it a bit higher. So very straightforward advice. But opening every 4th row, that is where I want to talk a bit more about. Opening those rows costs labor. It's labor intensive. You have to get a machine through and have someone individually open all those bungees and then closing them again. It involves risk, because if it hails, it defeats the purpose of the net. So does opening every 4th row increase bee activity on the crop, fruit, sets, seeds per fruit, and apple quality? Are there other benefits for the grower? Look, the grower doesn't really mind if some of the bees die, as long as he gets the pollination. So if he is to open the rows, he's got to have that advantage. Okay, so Then I need to talk a bit about apple production. Now, apples are a very marginal crop, and the growers are not out to maximize the weight or in apples that they have. They're out to maximize the quality. And a quality apple has no blemishes. That's not something that pollination can do anything about. It has a beautiful color. That's also not something that we can do anything about with pollination. It is of a certain size, and the grower manages that through fertilizer and water. The only thing we can do something about with pollination is symmetry. And an apple needs to be symmetrical. What's the difference? Well, 50 cents per kilo. That's the difference for the grower. You all buy round apples. Unless you buy organic, then you might buy crooked apples. So it's quality, not yield, and growers thin an enormous amount of apples. The large part of apples are removed very soon after set. Okay, so that is how apple production works. So when I asked, does opening above every fourth row increase bee visitation, fruit set, seed per apple, and symmetry, you have to keep in mind that the grower, when it comes to the end product, has thinned. So he selected the best apple. Now, this is a study done in two orchards, a blue orchard and a green orchard, blue orchard and a red orchard. And what we looked at was, are there differences in bee vegetation? And yes, under rows that are open, you get more bee visitation than under rows that are closed. Are there differences in fruit set? Yeah, there are, but a bit less so. And the blue orchard had very little bee visitation, really. So then we looked at the number of seeds per apple. For the blue orchard, there was no difference. For the red orchard, there was a difference. They had more seeds per apple. They had better visitation. So this is the final product, right? And but it didn't affect apple symmetry, really. So basically, the answer is yes, it makes a difference for bee visitation, fruit set, seeds per apple, and symmetry, but not for symmetry. Sorry. So we don't know yet whether it works. We need a larger sample size, but this is a lot of work already. And really what we want to do is we need to compare the production in an orchard that has every fourth row opened with the production in an orchard that has every fourth row closed, and then have 5 of each and have them comparable. Now, every apple orchard is different, and we can't do that. They have different varieties, they have different nets, they have different size, they have different strategies with bees and with fertilization, etc. So it is really difficult to do that. This gives a part of an answer, but not the whole answer. Now, the second thing we're working on is improving pollen delivery. And then again, I have to explain something about apples. Apples rely on cross-pollination with a different variety. They won't self-pollinate. And so you have to select your varieties in a way that they are cross-compatible and that they flower at the same time. Pink Lady flowers very early, and I have come across the situation where I asked the grower, well, what's your pollinizer here? And he will say, oh, that's them galas there. I said, huh? Those galas are not in flower. That's not your pollinizer. And he would say, oh, I don't know, because they don't know. And so in some cases, a lot of thought goes into designing an orchard. In other cases, well, it works, and otherwise we plant something else with it. So that is how things are in the apple industry, but they don't know how pollen moves through the landscape or what the importance of proximity of pollinizers really is. And so here we have Scott, and Scott asked the question, well, how close do those pollinizers really need to be? And he looked at the set in different rows, going from one pollinizer variety to the middle to another pollinizer variety. And what he found was, well, okay, rows, preferably. That's not how it is in apple orchards at all, but that is where you see the difference in set, right? Okay, so then he said, well, is it actually that variety that pollinates those rows? And so he basically asked the seeds, well, who's your daddy? And that was a very interesting project, and Scott got somewhere, and then he disappeared. And Lizzie took over. And so Lizzie is asking now, who's your daddy? And how's she doing that? Well, she grows the seedlings from the pips, and then she does microsats on them, and then we can determine what the father is, because we know the mother, right? And so what she's found so far, and this is a work in progress, is close to the flowering yellow variety, we have 100% yellow dads. On the other side, we still have 30 and 55% yellow dads. That's different ends. One end is open, the other end is in the middle of the orchard. And 3 or 4 other dads that we still need to identify, and we're going to collect the leaves to do that this afternoon. So we are going to also look in the middle and see how that pollen is distributed through the orchard. It is a first. Nobody has looked at it that way. Now, does that have application at all? Well, it may. I've got to say, the yellow ones were in full flower and the blue ones had very few flowers. So that is a matter of synchrony that we also need to take into account. And there were other varieties in the orchard. So it's not that easy, but we'll find out. It's hard to comprehend how that pollen gets through the orchard. It's really difficult because a bee collects pollen, goes along a row, goes back to the hive, brushes it off, and goes to another row. How does it end up 30 rows further down? I have no idea, honestly. It's not wind, we know that. We have really no idea. So this is to be continued, and I promised you novel technologies, and this is where Jay comes in. So the idea is that the proximity of pollinizers is really, really important. And that made me think, can we bring the pollinizers to the trees rather than rely on them being present in the landscape? Can we have mobile pollinizer units moving autonomously through the orchard? And that means that they take up no space in the orchard in the end, because they can be managed to flower synchronously. You can choose which pollinizer you want. It could reduce the number of hives that are needed in the orchard. And so Jay is looking at mobile pollinizer units. And what he's doing is he's sitting there on a ute and he's scoring how many bees he sees in a period of time. And on the ute are flowering trees. And he's looking at, well, how do the bees move onto my pollinizers and then onto the other trees? He's monitoring bee behavior. He's marking when a bee goes from the pollinizers to a flower that is pollinized, a flower from the mother tree, say, and looking at, does it increase pollination and set, and then checking whether this is our actual dad using microscopes. So what he found was that initially he had quite a long display on the ute, and he found that the bees ignored the display and went across the row. And then he broadened the display. And what he found was that many more bees would go and cross that way and visit our pollinators. So when it comes to bee visits per 10 minutes to the mobile pollinator units, the wide display did a lot better than the long display. This is also a work in progress. We need to show the difference in set and parentage. We need to have more luck with the weather, because last year we had 7 days to work with bees, really. The rest of the days were too cold. But if it has a future, there's an opportunity to collaborate with ECMS and have automated engineering, to have automated mobile pollinator units slowly making their way through the orchard. And that is something to look forward to. Now, I've been looking at how do we provide food for other pollinators over the years. And our main pollinators in the apples are farrow bees, Lasioglossum. They start in early spring, produce a generation, then produce another generation, and then overwinter as adults. So basically, they need food from early spring to midsummer. And so we've been looking at where do they go? What plants do they feed on? For the bees that go on apple, they also go on weeds in the orchard. They also go to native vegetation surrounding the orchard. And we have identified their food plants by visitation and by analyzing the pollen on their legs. And we have now some candidate native plants that can possibly be grown under net. Now, that's not easy, because those native plants need to be able to cope with the nutrient level there, which is not all plants do that. They probably need to be able to cope with the tractor driving over it now and then, which is also not so easy. And so an alternative is that we do alternate mowing of rows to enhance weeds. And that's already happening. I mean, for some of these things, apple growers simply think, if that works, I can do that. And then they do it. And so that it has been a suggestion, and a suggestion that has been taken up, just like opening the roof above rows has been taken up without any research. So what has been shown is that having weeds in the orchard can help with biological control as well as help the pollinators. And so that is really worthwhile. But I will do some candidate native plant trials in those greenhouses. So the other thing is orchard floor management under the trees. Now you've got different styles of orchards. You've got mounded trees and you've got flat. Underneath the trees, it can be herbicided, it can be mulched, or it can be bare. Or it can be just grassy. Now, the idea is those ground nesting bees need a place to nest, and they don't go very far. So our idea was, well, if you have a mounded bare soil, then you provide nesting opportunities for those bees compared to grass and weeds. And if it's mounded, the rain goes off like that and doesn't pool underneath the tree. So that was the hypothesis. And indeed, when the ground is bare, you have more bees than when the ground is vegetated under the trees. And when it is mounded, you have more bees than when it is flat. So that is interesting information for those who want to provide nest substrate for bees that pollinate apples. Okay, so in summary, We study how different nets and management of net affects bee behavior and apple quality, how bees move pollen through the orchard, and whether we can improve pollen delivery, how to manage the orchard floor for pollinator diversity and pollination resilience in the landscape. So that's what we're doing at the Bee Wing. It's not the only thing we're doing at the Bee Wing. So tomorrow at 4 o'clock, Nicholas Congetti is presenting his honors, and it is about whether a honeybee virus can cause disease in native bees. And I'm not going to give away his thunder, but if you're interested in that, please come to the winery at 4. Lizzie is starting a PhD on native bees and the microbiome. There's very little known about that. We're going to compare specialist and generalist bees. We're going to look at how the microbiome, what part of the microbiome is transmitted vertically. We are looking at hive health in protected cropping, which I didn't talk about. We do that together with plant food research. We are looking at plantings for other crop pollinating bees, and I'm actively promoting farmers to plant. And personally, I have been fascinated and continue to try to understand bee dietary choices, where eucalypts are a preferred food source in Australia, but not in Spain, Greece, Israel, or the US. Willows are a preferred food source in Europe, but not in Australia. Jacaranda is a preferred food source in Brazil, but not here. And so understanding that requires a whole heap of experiments and things that I'll be looking for money for. So that's what we're doing at the Bee Wing. And so I thank all the funding bodies. I have mentioned them. I'm not going to thank them again. I thank Beth Fung and Nick Timms for their help with things that I've presented. And I thank you for your attention. And think about bee health, in particular health of native bees. And I'll end with some nice native South Australian native bees for you to look at.
Very much, Katja. Those online, if you want to type any questions in the Q&A box for me to look at, and any questions from the audience, please.
I have 2 questions. The one will be your daddy slide that you showed. You showed that in some cases there were several daddies. Is that in the same apple in a different seed, or is it 3 different apples?
I have to say.
That fits, because if we say that there are at least 10 visits necessary for an apple to be nicely filled, then that means that different pollens can be deposited on different stamens. Yeah.
Second question is wanting to know Australian legislation. What's the legislation as far as the use of pesticides that you should not apply on flowering crops and the presence of flowers in the undergrowth in the orchard?
I am not sure that there is very much. There is recommendation not to use when bees are active, but there are no prohibitions as far as I know. And Australia is way behind the rest of the world when it comes to the use of pesticides. It is quite incredible. So things that are banned in Europe that cannot be used on bees are readily used here and available.
Michelle?
I was wondering, I wasn't sure if your diagram or imaging is logistically correct, but do they have like 5 or 6 rows of one variety and 5 or 6 rows of another variety, or have they taken the lead out for almond growers where they have a row with main road and a pollinator road and a main road and a pollinator road?
No, it is very different from the almonds. The almonds have one row, then another row, and those can cross-pollinate always. The apple growers have blocks, and they either have some crab apples dispersed through that, and they're tiny often. And I'd like to see whether those crab apples do anything for the pollination, because in some cases they don't flower at the same time. I've got an isolated block with pink ladies with crab apples that don't flower at the same time, and I don't know where the pollen comes from, but the apples set. And then you've got, as I depicted, that was sort of accurate. You've got pansy flowering here, then pink lady, then a gala that's not flowering yet. Then on the side there is some green star or something like that. Yeah. It varies enormously, but they don't do alternate rows, and I've asked them why not, and they say, yeah, that's too hard with picking. Of course, we've always done it that way. Basically, that's the answer.
Okay, and we have a question online. What are some of the candidate native plants, and do you think that they can thrive in orchards?
One of my candidates, I've selected for ground covers that either flower long or flower in summer. So one of the ground covers is Scaevola. It flowers very long. We can grow it as a rockery, so it can go around the side. Another one is Bubiala, because you can get those ground flowering things that flowers in summer, so that can be very good. Potentially Goodenia, but I'm not sure that it will grow very well in that environment. Those are a few of them, and then Chrysocephalum as well.
Sure.
You showed that some of the next bees stuck in them, but do we know where some of the nets are also just validation, where some of these kind of exploration and then try to find the hive patch and maybe find that there are anything like that?
We don't know very much about that. What we know is that generally bees are not good at being retrained. So if you take a beehive and part of the bees fly out and you put it on the net or somewhere else, you will lose those bees. So you will see a lot of attrition anyway. It's with nearly all bees, they cannot retrain themselves. We had an issue where under a big net, bees were flying out, and I was talking to the growers saying, look, all those bees disappearing. And I sort of said in my stupidity, others have opened the area above the hive or have bird net on top there. I come back the next, and he had opened it above the hive, and he said the bees were falling in by the thousands. So they sort of know where to go, but they can't get back. So that is an issue. So probably the area of netting is something that we need to take into account. And having strips of bird net where the bees can go in and out might be better for hive health. But I'm more interested in pollination. So whether that's one of the things we're going to look at. We're going to give hives fluorescent powder this year and place them on the side where they can get out through the bird net, or in the middle, and then see how that fluorescent powder distributes itself over the crop and what will give the best visitation.
Talking about the general health season, so that if you are going to use that, the hives for this kind of plant?
Beekeepers say that their hives suffer. We have been working together with plant food research to investigate that. But one of the reasons I'm not presenting that is that I don't trust the data that we've collected, because we looked at how many adult bees are in the hive. And if you put a good strong hive on the net for 3 weeks, 3 weeks later, you will still have adults because they come out. What you need to look at is the brood production. And that is what the beekeeper will see when he comes and fetches the hive, because he picks it up and says, weighs nothing. There's nothing in there. And there can still be many adults in there. So when beekeepers say, well, it really knocks them, they're probably right. It really knocks them to be put undercover. And yeah, that is an issue that is difficult to fix unless you open and allow them to go outside. But how that opening affects the activity on the crop, that's what I'm more interested in.
Well, thank you, everyone, and thank you very much, Katja, for presenting today. And we have tea and coffee and some biscuits out the back if you'd like to join us. So thank you very much.
Okay.